My Lords, the noble Lord Hampton has opened up with his amendments one of the most important and least discussed areas to do with bus operations in a way that actually presents many of us who have experience of responsibility one way or another, in my case a non-executive responsibility for a number of years for bus services, presents us with real challenges and difficulty, because the question we have to ask ourselves, I think, is whether the bus operators have the right mentality about safety. Now, I say that in the light of what's been achieved in the construction industry, for example, over the last 20 years, where a focus on zero accidents, zero injuries, has transformed the way of working. Of course, zero is never quite achieved, but very close to zero is now achieved on construction sites. But it's been a deliberate program and deliberate change in mentality that has brought that about. I think on the railways there is a strong focus on mentality, on that mentality. And I wonder if it exists in the buses. Are we, in fact, way out of date in our attitudes towards safety? I want to mention the fact that I've just become an officer of the newly reconstituted APPG on women in transport. And I want to mention it because of the relevance it has, is that many of these issues to do with safety are actually women's issues. There's the obvious question of violence against women and girls on buses, and the APPG is going to look at that. But there's the broader issue of safety in general. I don't have an up-to-date statistic, but it used to be the case quite a long, admittedly some years ago, that a very large percentage of women over the age of 65 presenting at A&E were there because they had suffered an injury inside a bus. Inside a bus, not a bus collision, but inside a bus. Because, very often, because of aggressive or inappropriate braking. On modern buses that, of course, have very sharp brakes, the safety regulators, of course, think, yes, we must have the sharpest and most modern brakes, just as you do on a motor car, but in a motor car you're sitting down and strapped in. And on a bus, you're very frequently standing up, because buses are designed to carry standing passengers. And sharp braking results in people falling over. And very often, proportionally, that is elderly women who are falling over and are being injured. Do we take proper account of that? Are we recording it? Are we thinking actively about what we should do about it? The situation has not improved in the 20 years or so. I've been making this point about women, elderly women, inside buses. And then there is the question of the way, and this is very pertinent to this bill, the way in which franchise contracts operate. Now, my experience is somewhat out of date, but it is a London-based experience where franchising is used, and it is the London model which is, the basis for this bill to some extent that is being rolled out elsewhere. But the emphasis in the contracts is on the timeliness, on keeping to the timetable. And that is very difficult in urban areas because of congestion and unpredictable events, including roadworks and so forth. So very often drivers are under pressure and have a clock. They're in direct communication, of course, with their control. They're under pressure to make up time because gaps in the service have arisen. And they can only do that by going faster and braking sharper. And quite apart from the effects which I've already mentioned on passengers, potential effects on passengers inside the bus, of course the risk of actually knocking into something, and often with very, very serious effect, if that something happens to be a live human body walking in the street, the likelihood of knocking into something is increased. And so we're all here saying how wonderful, we're not all of us saying it with the same level of enthusiasm, admittedly, but there are people in the room saying how wonderful it is that we're extending for a franchise model, but the structure of the contract on which those franchises are going to be based need to be looked at very carefully in the light of safety considerations. And I think we should all be very grateful to the noble Lord, Lord Hampton, for bringing this issue up. I'm not myself persuaded in relation to Amendment 60 that we should have a new and separate statutory provision about working time in this Act when we already have quite extensive and elaborate working time legislation elsewhere. But on amendments, is it 58 and 59, the first of his two amendments, there is a lot to be said in their favour, and I have a suspicion that they will reappear on report, and if they do, then I think they will deserve very serious consideration indeed.
Yeah.